The sun was setting in San Francisco, painting the sky with orange hues that contrasted with the dark clouds approaching the bay. Sarah watched the landscape through the window of her small apartment in the Nob Hill neighborhood, feeling the familiar weight of loneliness that had accompanied her for years. At 36, her life was a series of choices that had led her further and further away from the light. The walls of the apartment held secrets she preferred to hide. In a discreet corner, an old bookshelf housed objects that represented years of searching for power and control through black magic. Half-consumed black candles, dark crystals, and ancient books with pages yellowed by time told the story of a woman desperate for answers. "Miss Sarah." The voice of Mrs. Johnson, her elderly neighbor, echoed through the door, interrupting her thoughts. "Are you all right? I heard strange noises coming from your apartment last night." Sarah took a deep breath, trying to maintain her composure. The manifestations were becoming more intense, harder to hide. "Everything's fine, Mrs. Johnson. I just dropped some things while cleaning the room." "Are you sure, dear? You know you can count on me if you need help." The genuine concern in the lady's voice made something move inside Sarah. It was rare to find genuine kindness in her world of shadows. "Thank you, Mrs. Johnson. Everything's under control." The words came out automatically, a lie she repeated to herself every day. When the neighbor's footsteps faded away, Sarah turned her attention to the old mirror hanging on the wall. Her reflection showed deep, dark circles, the result of sleepless nights. Insomnia was constant, filled with nightmares and sensations, of invisible presences watching her in the darkness. That night, while organizing some documents for work the next day, an inexplicable cold wind blew through the apartment, extinguishing the candles she always kept lit. The shadows on the walls seemed to come to life, dancing in a disturbing way. "This has to stop," she muttered to herself, feeling her heart race. It was then that, from the depths of her most distant memories, emerged a memory. Her grandmother sitting in the old rocking chair, telling stories about Jesus and his power over darkness. A solitary tear rolled down her face as she realized how far she had strayed from those days of innocence. The choices she had made, seeking power and control through black magic, had only brought more darkness into her life. In her room, Sarah opened an old drawer and pulled out a dusty rosary, an heirloom from her grandmother. Her hands trembled as she touched it. For a moment, she hesitated. Years of occult practices had created spiritual barriers that seemed insurmountable. The sound of dragging footsteps in the empty hallway made her shudder. She wasn't alone, she never was. The presences surrounding her seemed more threatening each day, as if they knew she was considering seeking a different path. Jesus. The name escaped her lips like a sigh, almost inaudible. For an instant, the silence was absolute. Nothing happened, or at least that's how it seemed. But something had changed. A small crack had formed in the spiritual wall that imprisoned her. The next day, she woke up with a throbbing headache. Her job as an administrative assistant in an office in the financial district awaited her. Another day of routine in a life that seemed increasingly empty of meaning. During the bus ride down Market Street, Sarah distractedly observed the movement of the city. Street vendors, tourists, photographing the Golden Gate Bridge, faithful climbing the steps of Grace Cathedral. San Francisco pulsed with life and faith, something she had lost long ago. Her thoughts were interrupted by a lady who sat next to her, carrying a worn Bible in her hands. The book caught her attention, awakening old memories of simpler times. "You look tired, my dear," commented the stranger with a gentle smile. "Sometimes the weight we carry is not ours to bear." Sarah felt a shiver run down her spine. How could that lady know? Before she could answer, her stop arrived. She got up hurriedly, getting off the bus with unsure steps. It was in this moment of distraction that everything changed. Her heel got stuck in a crack in the sidewalk, and she lost her balance. The world seemed to spin in slow motion as she fell towards the busy street. The last sound she heard was the abrupt braking of a car, then only darkness. The first sensation was of lightness, as if her body had lost all weight. Sarah opened her eyes and found herself floating above a surreal scene, her own body lying on the asphalt, surrounded by an agitated crowd. Paramedics were running Sirens were sounding in the distance, voices mingling in a confused chorus. "We need to stabilize her," shouted one of the rescuers, his hands moving urgently over her inert body. "Pressure dropping, we need to act fast." It was strange to observe all of this with such detachment. There was no fear, no pain. For the first time in years, she felt an inexplicable peace. The shadows that had tormented her for so long seemed to have completely disappeared. The scene suddenly changed, and Sarah saw herself in the corridors of San Francisco General Hospital. Doctors and nurses were running with her body on a stretcher, exchanging technical information at a frantic pace. She followed them, floating effortlessly, observing every detail with impressive clarity. "Cardiac arrest," announced one of the doctors, "starting resuscitation procedures." It was then that she realized she was no longer bound by physical limitations. She could see through walls, feel the vital energy of each person in the hospital. It was as if a veil had been removed from her eyes, revealing a much deeper reality than she had ever imagined. In the midst of this extraordinary experience, a light began to form in the corner of her vision. It wasn't like any light she had ever seen before. It was alive, pulsating, calling her with an irresistible force. As she approached, the light intensified, enveloping her in an embrace of pure love. It was then that he appeared. The presence was indescribable in its majesty. Jesus was before her, and yet he seemed to be everywhere at the same time. His face radiated such deep compassion that Sarah felt all her defenses crumble. "Daughter." His voice resonated not just in her ears, but in every fiber of her being. "You have been searching in dark places for what could only be found in the light." Tears were flowing freely now, but they were different from all she had ever shed. They were tears of recognition, of a long-awaited encounter. Every moment of her life passed before her eyes, the choices, the fears, the misguided searches. "Lord," she tried to speak, but words seemed inadequate in the face of such presence. "I know, Sarah. I know of every night of loneliness, of every ritual in search of power, of every tear shed in darkness, and yet I never stopped loving you." With a gentle gesture, Jesus touched her heart, and Sarah felt something break inside her. Years of spiritual bondage, pacts and curses dissolved like mist under the morning sun. It was as if every cell of her being was being washed, purified, renewed. "But why now?" she managed to ask. "Why after so long in darkness?" "Because you called my name," he answered, with a smile that contained all the love in the universe. A whisper was enough to open the gates of heaven. The scenes of her life continued to pass, but now she could see something she had never noticed before, a constant presence, even in the darkest moments. Jesus had always been there, patiently waiting for her to recognize him. "You have a choice to make, Sarah," he said, his gaze penetrating to the depths of her soul. "You can stay here where there is no more pain or darkness, or you can return. There are people who need to hear your story, souls trapped in the same chains that imprisoned you." Sarah's heart tightened. How could she go back after experiencing such peace? How would she face a world that wouldn't understand her transformation? "Do not fear," Jesus continued, answering her unexpressed thoughts. "My light in you will be stronger than any darkness. Through your testimony, others will find their way home." Before she could answer, Sarah felt a gentle force beginning to pull her back. Jesus' face began to recede, but his voice remained clear. "You are no longer alone, Sarah. I will be with you always, even to the end of the age." The first sound Sarah heard upon returning was the constant beep of cardiac monitors. Her eyes opened slowly, adjusting to the fluorescent light of the hospital. The medical team watched her with barely disguised amazement. "It's a miracle," murmured a nurse, making the sign of the cross. 22 minutes of brain death, doctor." Richards, an experienced neurosurgeon, checked her vital signs with an expression of disbelief. "Miss Sarah, can you hear me? Do you know where you are?" "San Francisco General Hospital," she answered in a hoarse voice, surprising everyone with her lucidity. "And yes, doctor, I know exactly what happened." In the days that followed, Sarah underwent an endless battery of tests. The doctors sought scientific explanations for her extraordinary recovery, but the results only increased the mystery. There were no neurological sequelae, no permanent damage. It was as if the accident had never happened. During this period, she began to notice profound changes in herself. The darkness that had once suffocated her had been replaced by an inexplicable peace. The shadowy presences that had tormented her had completely disappeared, as if they had never existed. One afternoon, she received a visit from her younger sister, Emily, who had traveled from Los Angeles as soon as she heard about the accident. The reunion was emotional, but Sarah soon noticed the discomfort in her sister's eyes when she began to talk about her experience. "Sarah, you hit your head hard," Emily argued gently. "It's normal to have hallucinations in these situations. The doctor himself explained that the brain can create these images." "They weren't hallucinations, Em," Sarah replied firmly, a new conviction in her voice. "What I experienced was more real than anything in this world. I met Jesus." "Jesus?" Emily laughed nervously. "Sarah, you've spent the last few years immersed in black magic rituals. Since when do you talk about Jesus?" Her sister's words hurt, but didn't shake her certainty. Sarah could feel the Lord's comforting presence. Exactly. As he had promised, her transformation went beyond words. It was engraved in her soul. At night, alone in her hospital room, Sarah reflected on the challenges that awaited her. How would she explain her change to the people who knew her? How would she face the skepticism of those who, like her sister, would seek rational explanations for something that transcended reason? It was during one of these reflections that she received an unexpected visit. Mrs. Johnson, her elderly neighbor, entered the room silently, carrying a small rosary in her hands. "My dear," said the lady, her eyes shining with ancient wisdom, "I always knew that one day you would find your way back to the light." Sarah felt tears welling up. "You knew? All this time?" "Of course I did. Why do you think I prayed so much? For you?" Mrs. Johnson smiled, holding her hands. "Darkness can be powerful, but there is no darkness that can resist God's love." That moment marked the beginning of a deep friendship. The return home was a moment of confrontation with her old reality. Standing at the door of the apartment, Sarah took a deep breath before turning the key. The environment, once charged with dense and suffocating energy, now seemed empty, waiting to be filled with a new light. Her eyes scanned the objects that were once part of her rituals. Each item seemed to scream memories of nights of desperation and search for power. With determination, she began to collect everything in a large box: the dark crystals, the black candles, the ancient grimoires. "I don't need you anymore," she murmured, feeling an inner strength she didn't know. "My power comes from another source now." The phone rang, interrupting her spiritual cleaning. It was Teresa, her former mentor in the ways of black magic. "Sarah, I felt your absence in the rituals." The familiar voice sounded controlled, but with a touch of veiled threat. "The entities are restless with your withdrawal." A shiver ran down her spine, but it was no longer of fear. "Teresa, I appreciate everything you taught me, but I found a new path. Actually, he found me." "You know it's not that simple," Teresa replied, her voice hardening. "There are spiritual commitments that cannot be broken." "All commitments have already been broken on the cross," Sarah replied with a conviction that surprised herself. "Jesus freed me." The silence on the other end of the line was cutting. When Teresa spoke again, her voice was laden with irony. "We'll see how long this conversion of yours lasts." After hanging up, Sarah sat in her favorite armchair, letting tears flow freely. They weren't tears of fear, but of gratitude. For the first time in years, she felt truly free. In the following days, she began to reorganize her life. The apartment went through a transformation. The dark walls gained light colors. The heavy curtains were replaced by others that let the light in. Each external change reflected a deeper transformation in her interior. At work, people noticed something different about her. The heavy countenance gave way to a serene smile, and the aura of mystery that surrounded her was replaced by a contagious peace. "You're different, Sarah," commented Sandra, her department colleague. "Did something happen?" "A lot happened," she replied, smiling. "Want to have lunch with me today? I have an incredible story to tell." During lunch, Sarah shared her experience for the first time. She talked about the accident, the encounter with Jesus, the transformation she was living. Sandra listened attentively, her eyes widening as the story unfolded. "It's hard to believe," Sandra admitted at the end. "But looking at you now, I see that something really has changed." "I know it sounds crazy," Sarah replied, "but I've learned that there are truths that go beyond our understanding." That night, upon returning home, she found Mrs. Johnson waiting in the hallway. The lady was holding a Bible in her hands. "I thought you might want to start getting to know better the one who saved you," she said, extending the book. Sarah took the Bible with reverence. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened the pages, remembering how that same book used to cause repulsion in her. "Where do I start?" she asked. "The beginning is always good," Mrs. Johnson smiled. "But if you want, my suggestion, start with the Gospels. That's where we'll get to know Jesus' heart better." The two spent hours talking. Mrs. Johnson shared her own story of faith, talked about the years she dedicated to prayer, especially for Sarah. "Many nights I heard noises coming from your apartment," the lady confessed, "and in each one of them I knelt down and asked Jesus to free you." "So it was your prayers that saved me?" Sarah asked, moved. "No, my dear, it was God's love. I just had the privilege of being an instrument in His hands." Weeks turned into months, and Sarah's life found a new rhythm. Her mornings now began with Bible reading and prayer, precious moments of intimacy with the one who had transformed her existence. However, not everything was smooth sailing on the path of her new life. One night, she woke up startled. The room was freezing, and a familiar sensation of oppression hung in the air. For a moment, the old fear threatened to dominate her. "You think you can simply abandon us?" a voice whispered in the shadows. "We still have rights over you." Sarah sat up in bed, her heart racing. Jesus' words echoed in her mind. "Greater is He who is in you than he who is in the world." "In the name of Jesus," she declared firmly, "you no longer have authority over my life." The environment changed instantly. The cold dissipated, and a familiar peace filled the room. Sarah smiled, realizing she was learning to use her new spiritual authority. The next morning, she received a disturbing call. It was Emily, her sister. "Sarah, I need to tell you something." Her voice sounded worried. "Teresa contacted me." Sarah felt a tightness in her chest. What did she want? She said you're in danger, that you abandoned important commitments, and there will be consequences. Don't worry," Sarah replied, keeping calm. "Jesus is greater than any threat." "There you go again with this Jesus story," Emily exploded. "Sarah, you need professional help. This religious obsession after the accident is not normal." Her sister's words hurt, but Sarah remained firm. I understand your concern, but what I'm experiencing is real. More real than anything I've ever lived." The sun was setting over the bay when Sarah decided to take a walk to Grace Cathedral. Her steps echoed through the historic corridors of Nob Hill, while her mind wandered between memories and prayers. As she entered the church, she noticed a familiar figure kneeling on one of the benches. Her heart raced as she recognized Mark, her ex-fiancé, who had distanced himself from her years ago when she began to get involved with occultism. "Sarah?" His voice sounded surprised when their eyes met. "I didn't expect to find you here." "I didn't expect to be here a few months ago," she replied with a soft smile. "Things have changed a lot, Mark." They sat on one of the church benches, and Sarah shared her story. Mark listened attentively, his eyes revealing a mixture of astonishment and relief. "You know," he said after a moment of silence, "I never stopped praying for you. Even after we broke up, even when you were at your most distant." "You prayed for me?" she asked, feeling tears forming. "Every day. Something inside me said that one day you would find your way back." In that moment, Sarah understood that her story of redemption had begun long before the accident. God had used people like Mrs. Zoe and Mark to prepare the way. "Would you like to get coffee?" Mark asked. "There's a bakery nearby." During coffee, the conversation flowed naturally. Mark told her that he had become a youth leader in the church, dedicating his life to helping people struggling with addictions and spiritual problems. "When you drifted away," he explained, I decided to study more about spiritual warfare. I wanted to understand so I could help others going through the same thing. And now here I am, Sarah smiled, living a testimony I never imagined possible. Before they parted, Mark made an invitation that caught her by surprise. We have a support group at the church for people who have left the occult. Would you like to participate? Your testimony could help a lot of people. Sarah felt her heart race. It was the first time someone had suggested that she share her story publicly. The church hall was packed that Wednesday night. Sarah nervously watched people arriving for the support group meeting. Mark had prepared everything carefully, but she still felt the weight of responsibility. You don't need to be afraid, he whispered, noticing her anxiety. Just share what Jesus has done in your life. When it was her turn to speak, Sarah stood up with trembling legs. She looked at the faces in front of her, some curious, others skeptical, many carrying the same shadows she knew so well. My name is Sarah, she began, her voice gaining strength as she spoke, and 3 months ago I was dead. The silence in the room was palpable as she shared her journey. She spoke about the years of seeking power through black magic, about the emptiness that grew in her soul, about the moment she encountered Jesus during her near-death experience. I thought I had power, she continued, but I only found slavery. I thought I controlled spiritual forces, but they were controlling me. I had to die to finally find true life. As she spoke, she noticed some people crying silently. Others nodded, in recognition, as if her story echoed their own struggles. Jesus not only rescued me from physical death, she concluded, he rescued me from a much deeper death, the spiritual death I had chosen for myself. After her testimony, several people approached to talk. One young woman, in particular, caught her attention. Claire was only 19, but her eyes carried the weight of someone who had already seen too much. How did you manage to break free? Claire asked in a low voice. I'm also involved in these things, but I'm afraid to leave. Sarah held the young woman's hands, recognizing in her the same fear that had once imprisoned her. The first step is the hardest, but you're not alone. Jesus is greater than any pact, any curse. That night marked the beginning of a new chapter in Sarah's life. Her testimony began to spread, and more people sought her help. Each story of liberation confirmed that her mission was just beginning. The success of the support group and the growing number of people seeking help through Sarah's testimony did not go unnoticed. Teresa, her former mentor in the ways of occultism, decided it was time to act. On a rainy afternoon, Sarah found a package in front of her door. Inside were objects she recognized immediately. They were items she had used in her old rituals, some with her own blood. My dear, Mrs. Zoe's voice sounded concerned from the hallway. What is that? Sarah felt a chill, but the presence of Jesus in her heart was stronger than fear. These are attempts to make me go back to the past, Mrs. Zoe, but they have no power over me anymore. That night she gathered with Mark and other church leaders for a prayer session. As they burned the cursed objects, Sarah felt a supernatural peace. Are you sure you want to continue with the work in the support group? Mark asked, concerned. Things might get harder. I've never been so sure, she replied firmly. Every soul set free is worth any battle. The following days brought more challenges. People close to her began to distance themselves. Old friendships dissolved. Even at work, Sarah began to face inexplicable situations. Is your computer having problems again? Asked Sandra, her colleague, after another mysterious glitch. That's the third time this week. Sarah smiled, recognizing the enemy's tactics. Don't worry, this too shall pass. The tension reached its peak on a stormy night in New York. Sarah was conducting another support group meeting, which now had dozens of participants, when Teresa burst through the church door. So this is where you've been spreading your lies? Teresa's voice cut through the air like a razor. Her eyes, normally controlled, shone with supernatural fury. Panic set in among those present. Some recognized Teresa as a well-known leader of occult practices. Others instinctively felt the dark energy she emanated. Sarah, however, remained serene. Teresa, you're welcome to hear what Jesus has been doing in our lives. Jesus? Teresa laughed scornfully. "You think you can simply erase years of dedication to the ancestral forces? You made blood pacts, Sarah." "Pacts that were annulled by the blood of Christ," Sarah responded, with an authority that surprised everyone. Teresa advanced towards her, but something stopped her. It was Claire, the young woman Sarah had helped weeks before, who now stood between them. "I was trapped too," Claire declared, her voice trembling but firm. "But Jesus set me free through—" Sarah's testimony. One by one, other people stood up. Former occult practitioners, family members of people involved in black magic, each with their own story of liberation to tell. Teresa watched the scene with a mixture of fury and disbelief. The church lights began to flicker, and an inexplicable wind blew inside the closed building. "I don't know what forces you're dealing with," Teresa shouted, her voice changing to a tone that no longer seemed human. It was at this moment that Sarah felt something familiar, the same loving presence she had encountered during her near-death experience. Without fear, she stepped forward. "Teresa," she called softly, "I know exactly what forces we're dealing with, and I know that Jesus is greater than all of them." The words seemed to hit Teresa like a physical blow. She staggered, and for the first time, Sarah saw tears in her eyes. "How can you be so sure?" Teresa asked, her voice now almost a whisper. "Because I died, Teresa. I saw the other side, and I can assure you all the power we think we have through occultism is nothing compared to God's love." The storm outside reached its peak, but inside the church something extraordinary was happening. Teresa fell to her knees, sobbing, as years of involvement with darkness seemed to detach from her like broken chains. 6 months passed since the night of the confrontation with Teresa. The support group had transformed into an official ministry of the church, and Sarah saw the transformative power of her testimony daily. Teresa, after her own experience of liberation, was going through a deep process of restoration. Her presence at the meetings, now as someone seeking healing, was a living testimony to the power of God's love. On a quiet afternoon, Sarah was in her renovated apartment, now an environment of light and peace, when she received an unexpected visit. It was her sister Beatrice. "Sarah," Beatrice began, her eyes watery, "I came to ask for your forgiveness. All this time I doubted your experience, tried to rationalize." Sarah hugged her sister, feeling years of distance dissolve in that moment. "You know what made me change my mind?" Beatrice continued. "Seeing Teresa transformed. If even she, who was so immersed in darkness, recognized the truth of your testimony." The two sisters spent hours talking, making up for lost time. Sarah shared details of her experience that she had never told before, and Beatrice finally opened her heart to listen. That night, after Beatrice left, Sarah went up to the building's rooftop. The sun was setting over the New York skyline, painting the sky with colors that seemed to celebrate God's glory. Mark joined her, bringing 2 cups of coffee. Their relationship had been renewed in recent months, now based on a shared faith and a common purpose. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, observing her contemplative look. "About how God transformed the greatest tragedy of my life into the greatest testimony of His grace," she replied, smiling. "You know, when I woke up in the hospital after those 22 minutes, I thought it would be impossible to explain to people what I had experienced. And now? Now I understand that I don't need to explain. I just need to live what I learned. The truth doesn't need to be defended. It proves itself." Across the city, in the illuminated windows of various homes, people who had been touched by Sarah's testimony were experiencing their own journey of liberation. The truth that had set her free continued its work, reaching hearts, transforming lives, one story at a time. In her apartment, Mrs. Zoe smiled as she made her nightly prayers. Her years of prayers had been answered in a way that surpassed all her expectations. And in the streets of New York, where Sarah had once encountered death, new life now flourished. Her testimony echoed through the historic corridors of the city, proving that there is no darkness so deep that light cannot reach, nor chains so strong that love cannot break.